Welcome to the Mindful Space. Today we're joined by the remarkable Dr. Courtney Tracy, aka the Truth Doctor. From battling borderline personality disorder to becoming a leading voice in mental health, Dr. Courtney's journey is both relatable and inspiring. Join us as we uncover the truth about BPD, tackle stigma, and explore the impact of social media on mental wellness. Welcome back to another episode of the Mindful Space. Today we have lovely Dr. Courtney.
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making this possible. I know having a newborn can be hectic, so thank you for making the time. So today I want to talk about BPD, or borderline personality disorder. I know, this is a subject that's very fun to you. You have your own experiences as well as serving this population or clients that have to deal with it. Do you mind sharing some insight, some light on how does your personal journey influence what you do nowadays?
Well, I became a licensed clinical social worker in 2016 as an associate, became licensed 2 years later, and always specialized in substance use primarily in my career. And the reason for that was 5 years before I actually started practicing and supporting clients with substance use and addiction issues, I went into my own recovery for borderline personality disorder at 22 years old. When I was growing up, I experienced a lot of tumultuous emotions, a lot of traumatic experiences, and come to find out I've been neurodivergent my entire life, and that was actually what was underneath the development of my borderline personality disorder. So it was the dysregulation sensorily, the inability to communicate with others in a similar way as most people do, traumatic experiences, and a difficult upbringing with my parents that ultimately led to borderline personality disorder. I started showing symptoms when I was a teenager. They got really, really bad in young adulthood, and I was given an ultimatum by my high school boyfriend, now husband, to basically get my life together.
Interesting.
or he was going to leave me. And as a therapist, people ask me about ultimatums a lot. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're necessary. And for me, the ultimatum to get my life together worked. It led me to a psychiatric ward and destabilization and detoxification unit, or a stabilization and detoxification unit. And I was diagnosed at 22 with borderline. It was a wild journey. It's been 11 years since then. And it took me a while to reduce my own symptoms to be stable enough to treat the population. So although I've been a therapist for 10 to 12 years, give or take what experience you consider, I've specialized in addiction. But over the last 5 years, I've been able to specialize in borderline because I now feel as though I've recovered from it.
Yeah, and I can see how that could be a conflict in the beginning if you're not completely dealing with it or healing, or you're going through your own personal journey, how it could be a trigger to treat someone with the same diagnosis.
And borderline personality disorder it's an interpersonal disorder. So if I can't have my head on straight when I'm having conversations with other people and manage my own emotions, there's no way I would be an effective therapist for people who needed those specific skills.
Oh, wow. And what are the odds? Did you know you always wanted to be a therapist? Or did it come from your experience in going, being on the other side?
People tend to know what they want their careers to be when they're very, very young. Often it's like police officers, lawyers, doctors. I don't actually know very many children who say, I want to be a therapist when I'm older. But usually teenagers can get to that point. Sometimes once you take your first Psychology 101 class, you think, this is very interesting. Maybe I'll be a therapist. What ended up happening for me wasn't that I decided I wanted to be a therapist. But at 15 years old, I went to rehab for methamphetamine and psychedelic use. And There, I realized that there were counselors, therapists, doctors, and rehabilitation
Oh,
centers
okay.
that actually want to help people heal. And so that's what I do now. I own treatment centers in California to help people heal with substance use and mental health issues.
I saw that. I was reading all about it and how you started, with one, and now you have a new one, a
Yeah.
bigger one. And I just find that amazing that you're able to help people that are going through what you
Yeah.
were going through. And I love the mission. I feel like a lot of the therapists have gone through a trauma or just like a rough experience, and then from there they kind of learned, oh well, I can save more people, how somebody else saved me. So it's kind of like a chain effect. We just want to help those because of those who helped us. And
Yeah.
I love that, at least from our careers. When we say borderline personality disorder, just for those that might have never heard about it or have heard about it but they don't really know what it is, do you mind giving us a brief
Not at
explanation?
all. So, borderline personality disorder, I think it's important to put a disclaimer that it's one of the most stigmatized disorders in the mental health arena. And often I'm asked why I think it's so stigmatized. Because if I were to list out what the criteria are right now, that question would be
Yeah.
answered already. The behaviors are behaviors that every human being experiences, usually, including suicidality, passive suicidality, thoughts of wanting your life to be different or end. But it's the intensity of the experiences, the frequency, the duration, and the fact that they're typically far out of proportion in comparison to what's actually going on for the person. So, as much as they're human behaviors that I'm about to discuss, remember that it's the severity of the symptoms. So, most people consider borderline personality
Hmm.
disorder to be an interpersonal disorder and an emotionally dysregulated disorder. At the basis of the disorder for individuals who have it is a fear of abandonment. And I think that people don't quite understand what that actually means. So nobody wants to be alone. Nobody wants to be isolated. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
we want to if the people around us are annoying or we want it to be quiet or something, but most of the
Yeah.
time people don't mind being around others and they desire to be around others. Fear of abandonment isn't just not wanting to be alone. It's having your identity attached to whether or not somebody wants to be around you. So it's sort of this level of security that you get, knowing that people will be there for you, and an intense fear that they're going to leave instantly and you're going to be all alone. So everyone has a sense of a fear of abandonment, but this fear of abandonment defines the behaviors for the people that have borderline. So if we have a fear of abandonment,
Okay.
part of what that's also rooted in is identity. As I just mentioned, I am somebody if other people believe I am somebody. And so, along with this fear of abandonment, is a lack of sense of self. I don't quite know who I am, but I know who I am in relation to you. Often, this develops growing up in
Okay.
childhood because there isn't an appropriate level of mirroring between the parent and or the environment and the child. We used to think that
Okay.
borderline developed because people were traumatized. People went through child abuse or something like that through their formative developmental years.
Mm-hmm.
That puts a lot of the blame on parents. Parents intentionally abusing and harming their children, leading to personality disorders, specifically borderline. What we've come to realize is that it doesn't have to be that somebody experiences a traumatizing, abusive, neglectful relationship with their parents to develop borderline, which would make sense. Fear of abandonment, and I don't quite know who I am
Yeah.
because you didn't treat me as a person and you loved me and hated me, or you never loved me at all. We used to think that makes sense, so that's got to be what it is. What we're coming to find out
Yeah.
now, and what also is represented in my story, is that it can simply be a disconnect between the individual and the environment. So for me, developing these symptoms of fear of abandonment and lack of sense of self came from being autistic and having my family. Well, I grew up with an uncle who has severe autism. I grew up with him in my household. So a lot of
Okay.
the attention when it came to mental health and issues were, if we don't act like Stephen, then we're fine.
Okay, got it. So he set the standard of what mental health issues was in your
Exactly.
household.
So when I was little
Okay.
and I was experiencing intense sensory overwhelm, rigidity and needing routines, inability to manage my emotions, all of the symptoms of undiagnosed autism in girls, I developed these maladaptive coping skills. I didn't develop a sense of self and identity. And I did develop a fear that people were going to come and go constantly and not really pay attention to my needs. So, the fear of abandonment and the lack of sense
Okay.
of self are the two primary criteria for borderline. And those are a lot of the ways that they're rooted. Now, quickly on top of those two criteria are really everything that presents on the outside: uncontrollable anger, unstable relationships, panic attacks, physical violence, substance use, the potential for self harm, dissociation, and suicidality. So it sounds scary if you just list them out like that.
It does, but you're living proof that, if managed, then you can achieve
Yes.
great things. Now, when we, well, you mentioned a little bit how it's like the most stigmatized diagnosis in the mental health field. What are key reasons, or why do you find it important to address these
Mm.
misconceptions?
I think it's really twofold. When I think about how many people on the planet are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, just in general, it's like over 10% of the population. And people don't quite realize that.
Wow.
More so in inpatient treatment, it's 20% of patients. And outpatient treatment, it's also 10% of
Oh,
patients. That's a lot of people deemed dangerous, monsters, demons, unworthy of treatment, incurable, horrible. The importance of destigmatizing this disorder is that people deserve to be seen as human beings that are struggling, that had an upbringing that is atypical, and they survived it somehow, but they survived it carrying these defense mechanisms that they no longer needed. But those defense mechanisms are scary to other
yeah.
people. If you have someone screaming at you because they're scared, you're going to be more scared for yourself than you are concerned about what they're scared about. So what happens is our outward
Mm-hmm.
behaviors push people away when all we really want is for people to come close to us because we have a fear of abandonment. But we're so afraid of being hurt that we
Okay.
would rather push people away first. And so that's scary to people. This person's angry, and this person, even when I try to connect with them, is kind of scary. And so it's lost on a lot of
It's hard.
people. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is, as I mentioned in the beginning of this interview, all of the feelings that people have that have borderline are feelings that a lot of people experience even if they don't have borderline. But what is the judgment when we experience it ourselves? So for example, if you, Michelle, were to get very angry at somebody and you accidentally, because it's not part of your character, your personality, lashed out at them and got really, really mad to the point where they were like, oh my God, what's wrong? Like, I've never seen you act like this before. Your
Yeah.
reaction would likely be, oh, I
Okay.
feel bad about this. I'm embarrassed by this. I don't want to have this behavior. So because we feel that way about ourselves, when we see someone with a diagnosis that says these people act like this all the time, you're instantly going to think, oh, then that is bad, because your brain says it's bad. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So then it automatically thinks everyone else is bad for doing it.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense because that is how we see it and how we're taught and what we do tell
Yeah.
ourselves, unless it's served it this
Yeah.
way. And we don't
Right.
feel bad. Just walk away. No, still unacceptable. Well, with all these characteristics, I can only imagine um, the difficulties in building relationships, keeping connections. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. You know, as much as borderline personality disorder is considered an interpersonal disorder and does significantly affect relationships, when it comes to the borderline symptoms that I had and some that I do still experience, they've actually led me to bonding more with people than bonding less with people. And that is something that I don't think, most people
Interesting.
would expect. But the reason for that is I found the party crowd of people. People that use substances, the people that were also impulsive, the people that were also overly outgoing inappropriately at times. And so it actually, for me, my borderline symptoms made it easier to make friends and hold those relationships. What it didn't do was help me make healthy relationships and friendships. And I think that distinction is
Okay.
important.
Very important.
However, a
Yeah.
lot of people that I've treated that have borderline also have underlying neurodivergency. And I'm so glad that the research is starting to show that. And neurodivergency makes it extremely difficult to build and maintain friendships. So over the course of my life, I never really understood why it was so easy for me to make friends with people who were very similar to me, using substances, staying out all night, and why it was so difficult for me to make friends or maintain relationships with people who didn't have this really dangerous lifestyle. Come to find out, it's because I don't really understand how to communicate with people on a fundamental level. I'm just really good at speaking. Like, because I learned how to do that to
Yeah.
get through my life and learned how to do it very, very well. So it's interesting
Mm-hmm.
that the underlying mechanisms behind why someone develops borderline is usually the actual barrier to them making relationships and not the borderline itself, even though it would seem like that's the main reason.
What an interesting combination. And we did a podcast episode on that, on being diagnosed as a neurodivergent like later in life. And we spoke about how most of the population is not even aware. It's really hard to recognize when you're in that like fine line of kind of normal, not normal. Oh, she's just mad, or she just can't control her
Right.
emotions. And it's severely
It is.
underdiagnosed, you know. How old were you, if you don't mind me asking, when you
10
discovered
years
this?
later. So I was diagnosed with
Oh,
borderline
wow.
at 22 and autism at 32.
Look at
Mhm.
that. Wow. Interesting. What a
I know.
combination,
And
too.
it's a combination that makes
Are
sense.
there yeah, are there specific triggers or stressors that tend to exacerbate the symptoms of those who have
Yes,
BPD?
there are. Um, we say in relationships in general, outside of mental health, even, that we treat the people closest to us the worst. Because we do. We think, oh, I can, be a little snappy at my partner over here, but I'm not going to be
Yeah.
snappy at my boss. You know what I mean? We kind of give ourselves this flexibility.
Yes.
It's more intense for people with borderline personality disorder. And what people, so normally when someone hears this person has borderline personality disorder, they think, oh my God, what are they going to do to me or something? Which is,
Yeah,
yeah,
they're just
which is
crazy.
ridiculous. It's ridiculous,
Okay.
but it makes sense. But if you're someone that's really close to someone with borderline, then it might not be that much of an incorrect perspective to have, because the mind of someone with borderline is the mind of someone with a really good memory. So the longer that you're in a relationship with someone that has borderline personality disorder, the longer the list they have of things that you've done to upset them, hurt them, embarrass them, lie to them.
Really?
And so fundamentally, the closer the relationship, the more potential for toxicity. And the more work that needs to go in on the partner's behalf or the family member's behalf, just as much as the person with borderline personality disorder. And here's why. In order to heal relationally from borderline personality disorder, you have to have a healing environment. And what that takes is someone who isn't going to lie to you, who's going to listen to what you have to say, who's going to remember the things that you ask. And that's hard to do in any relationship, to always be perfect. But for someone with borderline personality disorder, if you're not perfect, then, and you accidentally step on a very small tripwire that you think is like, oh, I was just snappy at them because they were like being kind of annoying, you know? And then, but then that small tripwire explodes a huge bomb in the person that has borderline, because you just activated their whole list of every time you've ever lied, every time you've ever ignored them when they've talked. And so the main trigger is historical pain. And I've never heard somebody talk about it like that before, but that's the main trigger, is historical pain. If someone close to you does something that they've done in the past again, in the same way, with the same minimization or the same lack of care, then it sets off a reaction as though all of it is happening again.
It makes sense. And I can see how that can be in any other relationship as well. But specifically for borderline, it will just make you explode. In your work, your therapeutic work, what approaches have been or you've found to be most effective when treating BPD? Like, is it treatable? What kind of treatments do you recommend besides being in a healing environment?
It's treatable. For a long time, it was thought to not be treatable. For those of you who really don't know much about it, the listeners, it's called borderline because when they were trying to figure out how to categorize all the things, all the ways that humans' minds, brains, and bodies can go wrong, they realized that they found this group of individuals that presented with really similar symptoms, and they all seemed to be on the borderline of psychosis and neurosis. So what that means is someone that's neurotic is someone that's extremely anxious, always on edge, like needs everything to be perfect, and, you know, has a bunch of tripwires, basically. So on the border of neuroticism and being psychotic. Now, what that means isn't necessarily hallucinations or delusions in the way that we would think of somebody being in psychosis, for example. It's more so that it's a skewed perception of what's going on in the world, because there is this paranoia of being left and this perspective on what people are doing that it's more harmful than they may be meaning for it to be. And so on the borderline of psychosis and neurosis. Now, what in the world helps that? You know, what can help that?
We need a new diagnosis now.
So basically, for a long time, they thought if somebody developed their personality like this throughout their childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, there's no changing it. This is who these people are. We all have our personalities and they stay that way. But people change. Fundamentally, people change. Even just with age, you know, your values change. You start to live a slower life and you start to see things differently. What's interesting is that people don't apply that to human beings that have mental health disorders, but why should we be any different? The human brain matures, it maturates in the same way in all of us throughout our whole lives. With that said, the incurability is now not necessarily something that people believe anymore, but they still believe that we're dangerous, which is fine. We'll work on that. There has been some interventions that have been developed, and one of them is dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that specifically looks at areas that people with borderline need the most support with: mindfulness, interpersonal communication, emotional regulation, things of that nature. It was also created by a therapist with borderline. So very exciting. Her name is Marsha Linehan, and she's the only other clinician that I know of that's come out with having borderline, and she's the one that created the most effective treatment for it, which is incredible. Now, what I've been working on,
Yeah.
because thank God for her and what she's created that's helped so many people, Dr. Linehan, is I don't necessarily do DBT work with my clients. And DBT work probably only helped me about 50% on my recovery journey. The other 50% was consciousness, understanding what it is and how we actually perceive the world as humans, how we form our opinions, our judgments, like literally how our brain makes decisions. Because for a long time, in myself and for people with borderline, the brain instantly makes choices. That person's trying to hurt you. That person's going to leave you. That person. And it's so fast
Mm,
paced that I had to learn how to consciously slow down and control what was seemingly uncontrollable.
breathe.
Yeah, consciousness and existentialism. So
Okay.
that's the work that I do with people. Existential therapy for people with borderline personality disorder. So we get to the root of who are you, because it's an identity issue. Who are you? Let's develop your sense of self. Let's develop your value base so that even if your brain is saying, this person is going to hurt me and I need to scream at them, you can have values that say, no, I value respect. Existentially, as I am a
Okay.
person, I identify with the value of respect. And so I'm not going to yell at this person because I live a value-based life. And a lot of that is acceptance and commitment therapy mixed with existential psychotherapy. But the
Yeah.
only rooted modality is DBT right now. But I say, quote me, that over the next 10 years.
Yeah. No, but I can see, yeah, I can completely see how ACT combined with
Yeah.
existentialism and mindfulness and all that could have a deep benefit for that type of
Yeah, definitely.
population. And you've been using it. I'm assuming it's
Yeah,
working.
yeah. And I actually just finished writing my debut book. It's called Your Unconscious is
Mm.
Showing. And what it actually does is it teaches people everything that I learned about how the human body, brain, and mind work and how to recover from all of the systems within us that we would like to recover from impulsivity, anger, anxiety, and so on. So that's exciting because I feel like it might contribute to a new way of people
Yeah.
thinking how borderline can be healed.
I think it's exciting anytime that clinicians or therapists or just researchers find new methods of treating all these different diagnoses because it's not one treatment might not work for someone and it might work for someone else. Like you said, DBT 15%, for others it might be a game
Right.
changer. So the more treatment options, the more modalities we have,
Yeah,
then the better.
absolutely.
I'm all for it. Then the client
Right.
can just
Yeah,
choose, right?
exactly.
um I want to kind of answer this question already. For those that are unfamiliar, how does substance use intersect with BPD and what considerations should be taken in
Great
treatments?
question. Very good question. Often it's described that people that have borderline personality disorder have third degree emotional burns, and that
Mm,
emotions feel so much more intense for them than they do for other people. And I can attest to that. Feeling that
yeah.
way often leads people to want to not feel that way. And one really quick way to change how you feel is to put substances in your body. So oftentimes there is co-occurring disorders between people that have borderline personality disorder and people that have substance use disorder. The impulsivity also contributes to a desire to use substances because it's not only the impulse to not want to feel a certain way, it's the impulse to just instantly feel different and to have some type of impact. And so substances are very beneficial for that. Not that they're beneficial for the person, but they're
Yeah.
a bad solution to the issue of not wanting to know how you're feeling.
You always hear about substance use disorders being rooted from trauma, right? Nobody thinks BPD, or at least not anybody who's out of the mental health field, like the general population. They just think, oh, they must have gone through like a lot of trauma and now they just have
Yeah.
psychosis or whatever. But BPD is not really talked about,
Yeah.
I believe. Are there common coping mechanisms or strategies for individuals with BPD to navigate the emotional
Yeah.
dysregulation?
There's a lot, actually. When it comes to dialectical behavioral therapy, it's a skills-based intervention. It's a skills-based modality. So, I mean, I can think of 10 off of the top
Okay.
of my head, acronyms that are used to provide step-by-step
Mm.
instructions for people with borderline. Like, if you're going to have a conversation with someone, instead of telling them to F off after 30 seconds because you don't like what they said, you should instead do A, B, C, and D, even if you're upset. So often operationalized, skills-based interventions are best for people with borderline because what that does is it activates the critical thinking and planning part of the brain, which in turn
Okay.
shuts down to a degree. This is so simplified, but to a degree, the emotional part of the brain. And it's an emotional dysregulative disorder. So the more that we can get them into actually critically thinking, then it allows us to not emotionally think. And the best skill for that is actually through DBT, and it's called the wise mind, which means you have your rational mind and
Okay.
then you have your emotional mind. And what you want to do is meet them in the middle and think about various ways that what you're experiencing in the moment, how it could be perceived, and try to find one that makes the most sense, not just the one that feels the most right.
It's so hard though. Like you hear people, react. I was just reactive. Like it just came out. Like what can we do in the process of learning these skills to kind of stop ourselves from like, you have that thought and like what can you do in between to not react?
Yeah. I mean, that is the most difficult thing. You can slowly start to increase the
Mm-hmm.
space between what you experience and then your reaction. I mean, the first part to get even a space in there at all is just willingness. Like, will you actually pause for a moment? Like, will you? You'll see you will, but will you? And then
Yeah.
if you actually do pause, then it's two things to
Uh-huh.
maintain that space and grow it: safety and values. If you
Okay.
don't feel safe, your brain is going to immediately react. It's going to close the gap. Even if you've worked on this pause between what you experience and how you react to it, and it's big and big. If
It all
I mean,
goes down the window.
yeah, if
It's like
you think
goodbye.
about it, if you trained yourself to
Yeah.
like take 2 minutes to make decisions, that'd be amazing. But if your brain took 2 minutes to
That's a
make a
lot.
decision to jump out of the way of a moving car, you'd probably die. So if you're in danger or perceived danger, then that gap's going to close. So safety is the number one. Number two is values. If you have a space between what you experience and how you react to it, the way to keep that space is to know what you're doing in that time period. And what works best for people, what research
Okay.
shows works best for people, is values. Is the next step that I'm about to take rooted in who I want to be or not?
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought about values being such an important or playing such an important role in, to maintain that space. But yeah, so for some people, 2 minutes is a lot. Two
Right.
minutes is nothing. When you're being reacting to an emotion, two
Yes.
minutes is a lot, I think. And I feel like at some level, we've all kind of reacted to things, maybe not as often. So I'm sure a lot of us can relate to, feeling that emotion and just kind of like,
Yeah.
ugh. And then you regret it. You're like, oh, I didn't mean to
Yeah.
say that, kind of, but no.
Exactly.
So 2 minutes can make that
The two
difference.
minutes is a big deal because we've been shown physiologically that the physiological experience of an emotion lasts 90 seconds. The only reason that it has the potential to only last 90 seconds, naturally, organically, it's 90 seconds. What makes it last longer than that? The words that we put to the physiological feeling that we're having. So if we feel angry in our body,
Okay.
but then we say, I'm so angry that my husband did this and he never does anything that he's supposed to do. And when he comes home, I'm going to tell him that I'm mad at him. And we put these words and stories and to-do lists attached to those emotions. I felt angry, so now I'm going to bring this anger up
Okay.
later. And so it fuels this emotionality.
You're feeding the
Right.
negative emotion, and then it just
So the 2 minutes, you get the 90 seconds of feeling the emotion, plus at least 30 seconds to say, what do I want to do with this emotion now that I'm not actively in it anymore?
very important. 90 seconds, people. Go for a 90
Yeah.
second walk. How well, how is the understanding and treatment of BPD evolving in the field of mental health from when you first got diagnosed, for example, to now? What difference do you see, if any?
Well, when I was diagnosed at 22, I didn't know it was really stigmatized. I really didn't know. I had a reaction of, oh, good. At least there's like a label for something that I experienced. Now maybe there's other people that experience it, interventions that could help me with it, medications. There aren't medications, but I didn't know that at the time until I looked into it. Um, so it's kind of interesting because people often say that they feel like my platform has reduced the stigma related to borderline, but they wanted to know how I have handled it. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I'd never really noticed the stigma initially. Now that I have a platform
Oh,
and I
interesting.
say I'm a therapist with borderline, now I've seen the stigma.
Okay.
Now I've gone as far.
Tell
Yeah,
me more.
now I've had therapists and doctors personally direct message me and say, I know you're borderline. I can see your symptoms through you saying that you are recovered. You are not. It's so strange because I've never met these people, and uh, the
Yeah.
symptoms of borderline don't show up in my content anywhere. It's so strange because it's an interpersonal thing. Anyways, the stigma is real still. And I would say that the
Mm.
stigma is rooted in the field and then it goes out to the general population. So one thing that I've seen change is
Okay.
as much as the stigmas like come out like of the ground and sort of
Yeah. Come
like
to
I've
the
become more
surface.
aware of it. I also think that people who used to have a stigmatized view of it or never had an opinion on it now see it more neutral or positive, even curable, maintainable, not as scary as it used to be. So that's really wonderful. Now, I will say that the
Okay.
Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial of 2022, when
Ah,
she's actually my friend now, Dr. Shannon
yes.
Curry, who I met and talked to her about this, I'm like, what was that like diagnosing Amber with
Yeah.
borderline for the nation to see? And then the responses that she got. And
Uh-huh.
that was difficult to have that sort of go across the nation. I had to go on and I spoke to 100,000 people live in the middle of the trial with all the lawyers covering the trial to talk about borderline personality disorder, sort of try to normalize it, not to address anything they were saying about Amber Heard, but to address what they were passively and in turn saying about every other person that has borderline. So
Yeah.
that was a tough moment for people with borderline personality disorder in the country.
I know, because if you didn't know about it, then now you definitely at
Right.
least have heard about it, and then you're doing your own research or looking at the newspapers, and all it's coming out is just negative associated to the disorder. Yeah,
Mm.
I can see how that could have been a very tough moment for the population because it was a tough
Right.
case on itself. I can imagine, the fact that, of course, I was drawn into it because of the mental health part of
Right.
it. But it was like a worldwide. Everybody knew about it. Everybody talked about it, and then people wanted to be the experts of,
Yes.
right? Like, oh, of course she has it. I knew it because you could
I
see it
know.
in her eyes, or you could see in that movie when she did this and that, and
And
I'm like, you don't even
right.
know the person. Like, okay, well, maybe
Yeah.
she's not the
Right.
best, but what is, the mental health might just
Right.
explain certain behaviors. It doesn't, just
Right.
make who she is.
I agree.
But to each its own. Reflecting of your impact on social media, like you said, now you have your center, you're doing a book. How has the digital landscape influenced the mental health of fellow creators and influencers,
When I first
or even
Yeah,
yourself?
that's a good point, because when I first became a mental health content creator, which I never expected, never attempted, never tried to do this, it just happened. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I thought, I'm not going to get swept up by this whole thing. Like, I'm not. But I'm a human being and I have dopamine and I have like the desire to want people to like the content that I'm putting out. And so very quickly, well, maybe not very quickly. I'm on my 5th year being a mental health content creator. And after about halfway through, like 2.5 years into it, I started really like experiencing mental health issues. Well, one, because I have identity and sense of self issues because of borderline to begin with. And so having so many people comment on me and what I'm doing, and I know who you are, I can tell who
Mm-hmm.
you are, or I love you so much, you're absolutely perfect. Just this constant, like,
Who do
yeah,
you
it's
listen to?
very overwhelming. And so
Yeah.
as a therapist, one, I was surprised at how much of an impact being a public figure can have on you, even if you understand how your brain works. You can still get low self-esteem or comparison or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I felt like I had a lot of privilege knowing what I know, having all my years of experience and education. And that what I needed to do in turn was help the other individuals that were getting rising platforms, that weren't mental health professionals, that were just people that were getting suddenly internet famous, suddenly a bunch of people commenting on their lives and feeling low self-esteem and getting depressed and just getting really unstable. And so now I coach really high profile, like the people that you'd see, people that the articles are about, those creators and those influencers. Now I coach
Okay.
them and meet with them to help them with their mental health as it relates to being a content creator specifically. So I'm not addressing their disorders or their specific symptoms outside of what is it like to come onto the internet and share who you are and have everybody have something to say about it.
And it's crazy because you see the comments, even people like, you'll have the pros and the cons for everything, right? And they'll come on your site either to love you or to hate you. But the hate, sometimes I'm just like, oh
Yeah.
my God, get a life. Like, why are you showing this? Why are you putting yourself out there? Why are you talking about your mental health? Why are you showing
Right.
yourself crying? And then all that person's trying to do is just create more awareness, or maybe that's the way they communicate or they connect with people. And it must be really hard. I mean, I can only imagine. I'm not that famous.
It's overwhelming for these people.
But working with them, I find it that amazing. I find that that's amazing because you're able to mix all the experience that you have as a clinical from a clinical experience to social media platforms experience, and now you're able to contribute and help them in
Yeah.
that
Yeah, it's
way.
interesting. And I've worked with a couple creators that have borderline, that talk about having borderline and have a platform. And so I'm kind of helping them dodge like stigmatizing comments too. Not only how do they handle it as a person, but how do they handle it now as a person in a similar boat as me, sort of being like the punching bag of the country for people who don't like borderline and want somewhere to go and say it?
Yeah. I got you. Excuse me. Well, looking ahead now, and you've done already so much, but what changes or advancements do you foresee in the general field of mental health and also in the BPD field? How can individuals access certain supports?
That's a great question. I see 3 questions sort of in that one. I'll start with the mental health space in general. I think we're starting to learn that, well, for a long time, the general public and clinicians often acted as though the way to resolve mental health issues is through individual pursuits. And I think we're realizing now more than ever that we need society to shift. We need the communities that we're involved in to shift. And so that's a really wonderful aspect of how the mental health viewpoint of at least this country is transforming. When it comes to personality disorders and the advancements there, we are fundamentally changing what we believe about personality disorders, how we even develop the criteria for personality disorders. And so that's very exciting. There's more awareness of exactly what is going on for people when they are diagnosed with a personality disorder. And really, we're looking at four
Mm-hmm.
areas of disorder or dysfunction: identity, self direction, empathy, and intimacy. And those are four areas that almost made it into the DSM 5 TR that just came out, but it didn't make it for some
Okay.
reason through the seminars and panels that they had while they were creating the book. They weren't willing to move forward with this new way to diagnose the criteria of any personality disorder, including borderline. But I'm thinking in the DSM-6, it will have this new way of categorizing and explaining it, which is going to lead to better treatment.
Okay.
And I don't remember the third
Yeah.
one.
I feel like they didn't change much. They kind of tweaked it. That's why they didn't call
Right.
it
Yeah,
six.
exactly.
So we're gonna add a few more things. Well, I want to say thank you for having this important conversation. Thank you for
Well,
sharing your story. Um, Thank you for sharing your story with the world and being a content creator when it comes to mental health. I always loved your reels and all that. I'm a
you.
fan. But thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, and let's continue to build upon
Yeah.
this, you know. I think the more we talk about it, the more it gets out there and just people get more knowledgeable on
Yeah,
this
I appreciate
diagnosis.
it so much. Anyone who's willing to have an open conversation about borderline means it really means a lot, because if we can even shift one person's perspective of this disorder, then in turn, what we're actually shifting is the way they're going to treat somebody with that disorder. And that just makes the world a better place. As cliche as that sounds. So thank
Yes.
you.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for our listeners. Please let us know your thoughts if you had this diagnosis or maybe you know somebody with BPD. We want to hear from you. And don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date. We do an episode every week, so I'll see you next time. Thank you.